Hello, and welcome to the podcast Quick Hits. I'm your host, Phil Gurski, President and CEO of Borealis Threat and Risk Consulting in Ottawa, Canada. This is episode number 5, and as you may remember, if you've been following this podcast so far, the whole point behind Quick Hits is to take a look at current events in the world of terrorism and counterterrorism as they're happening, and to provide some commentary and perspective on what it all means. Today's episode is a current event, although it doesn't necessarily, or at least at first blush, have anything to do with terrorism. And I'm referring, of course, to the world premiere of the new Star Wars film, The Rise of Skywalker. I've been watching Star Wars most of my life. I don't consider myself a Star Wars groupie, but I do recall the very first film that came out in the 1970s. I do recall taking my then nephew, who's now 45 years old, to see the first Star Wars film. So I've been around that long. I enjoy the films. They're fun. They're obviously action-packed, and the effects have certainly grown over the past few decades. The effects that you see in the latest film are quite much more advanced than what I remember back in the 1970s. But I want to ask a very important question about the Star Wars series. This is something very, very important to me, and it's something that you should ask yourselves as well. And that question is Luke Skywalker, and by extension the people with whom he works and fights, is Luke Skywalker a terrorist? You may think this is a trivial question, one that besmirches the reputation of the Star Wars series. A few podcasts ago, I did ask the similar question about the Joker in the new film with Joaquin Phoenix, and asked if he was a terrorist, and concluded that he was not for a variety of reasons. So let's ask the same question about Luke Skywalker. Is Luke Skywalker a terrorist? I'm going to fall back on the definition I've used throughout these podcasts and throughout my blogs and presentations over the past 20 years or so, in that I'm going to describe terrorism as a serious act of violence that's perpetrated for religious, political, or ideological reasons. So using that as a template, let's look at Mr. Skywalker. Is what he does in connection with his friends, is it a serious act of violence? Yeah. I mean, they destroyed the Death Star twice, didn't they? That sounds like a serious act of violence to me. How many Imperial soldiers were killed with lightsabers and those guns they use? A gazillion. So clearly, from a violence perspective, there's no question that this constitutes an act of terrorism. But, as we all know, violence is not terrorism necessarily. It has to be perpetrated for reasons that are, as I cited, religious, political, or ideological. So let's look at that aspect of this issue to see if we can answer the question about whether or not this is all just a bunch of terrorists. Let's start with political. Is what the rebels are doing political? Well, let's look at this. The Galactic Empire, or whatever you want to call it, has taken over whole star systems, taken over planets. They've ruled with brutality over all these worlds. And so what the rebels are trying to do is to gain freedom. They're trying to get rid of the Galactic Empire. Gee, where have we seen that before? How about 1979 in Afghanistan, when the Soviet Union rolled into that country and took over? That was certainly the desires and intentions of an empire, the Soviet Empire. Where else have we seen this? How about 2003 with the decision by the U.S. government to go into Iraq and occupy that country? That was a political decision. And what happened in the aftermath of both of those two invasions/occupations? Well, in the aftermath of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, we saw the rise of Al-Qaeda, which was really the world's first transnational Islamist extremist group. And in the wake of the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003, to allegedly get rid of Saddam Hussein and his threat of non-existent weapons of mass destruction, we saw the rise of an Al-Qaeda affiliate called Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which later morphed into Islamic State or ISIS. So there's no question that when you look at large entities, be they empires, be they countries, who go and take action elsewhere, that often leads to terrorism. And for what many would see as justifiable reasons. Groups are rising to try to get rid of the occupier, the usurper, the force that's on their soil that shouldn't be. So from that perspective, you could certainly see Luke Skywalker and his merry band of cohorts as a terrorist group. What about from an ideological or religious perspective? Here again, I would submit to you that what happens to Mr. Skywalker and the training he receives by Yoda and by the Samuel L. Jackson character who has the great name of, Mace Windu. You should call a rock band that, the Mace Windus. The Force, which Mr. Skywalker learns to use, looks to me like a philosophy. It's a worldview. It could even be construed as a religion. And as Luke learns to control this Force, going back to episode 1, as an aside, anyone else get confused by the numbering of the Star Wars series? Why does it start with number 4? Anyhow, I'm sure that the founders of the series had great ideas in mind, and it's all well beyond my understanding, but it is what it is. But anyhow, back in episode 1, of course, Luke Skywalker is a little boy, and he's discovered to have some kind of thing in his blood which shows the Force is strong, and he learns to use the Force, use a lightsaber and control things with his mind, blah, blah, blah. How is that any different than radicalization to violence? How is it any different than what Islamic State did to its young children? In fact, I find a fascinating parallel between training Luke Skywalker to use this device against the evil forces of the Empire to what Islamic State did with child soldiers in 2014, 2015. Is this a bit of a stretch for my listeners, or is there something there? So you could construe that the Force, in fact, is a philosophy. It's an ideology which does lead to the use of serious acts of violence, like blowing up Death Stars. So on both counts, I think you could argue that Luke Skywalker is a terrorist. Now, before I get hate mail from all the Star Wars groupies and fans, I want to just point out that, of course, there is another possible interpretation of this. If you recall Ronald Reagan's famous quote back in the 1980s about what was happening in Nicaragua, when there was a battle between the Sandinista government, which the Reagan administration did not like because they were Marxists and they were getting help from the Cubans and then the Soviet Union, which was still around, and a ragtag bunch of militants, to use a charitable term, called the Contras. Ronald Reagan asked the famous question, or he made a famous statement rather, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. So if you don't like calling Luke Skywalker and his friends terrorists, maybe you can call them freedom fighters. At the end of the day, it all depends on perspective, doesn't it? I think that most people, I would assume most people, are on the side of Luke and his friends, not on the side of Darth Vader and the Galactic Emperor. So from that perspective, we would like to see them as freedom fighters. But if you take the perspective of the bad guys, then there's no question that Mr. Skywalker and all the other people that fight with them, like Princess Leia and Han Solo and Chewie and all the other characters that have been created, they would see them as terrorists. And I'm pretty sure that if there was a listing process in the Galactic Empire, Luke Skywalker would be listed as an international terrorist. Anyhow, that's my views on the new Star Wars film. I do plan to go and see it. I'm sure a lot of you will as well. I hope you enjoy it. I'm sure it'll be a great film. But when you're sitting there in the theater with your popcorn and your drink, ask yourself the question, what is Luke Skywalker's motivation really all about? Could he be construed as being a terrorist? Anyhow, I hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you like this, you can certainly subscribe to this content, be it written or podcast, on my website, www.borealisthreatenedrisk.com. You can leave comments for me, and I'm hoping to get comments on this particular quick hit on Star Wars at Borealis Saves on Twitter, on LinkedIn, on Facebook, or on the other platforms where this podcast is being hosted. Hope you'd enjoyed it. I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to get your feedback or your ideas for further ideas. I'll talk to you again soon. Until then, stay safe.